I'm Sarah Mitchell, 28 years old, and I never thought I'd have to choose between honoring my mother's memory and keeping peace with my father. But when I walked into my childhood bedroom last Tuesday and found my mother's jewelry box in the trash, her handwritten recipes torn to pieces, and her wedding dress stuffed into garbage bags, I realized that some battles are worth fighting no matter the cost. My stepmother Jessica had finally crossed a line I couldn't ignore, and what happened next changed everything between us forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My mother Elena passed away 3 years ago after a long battle with breast cancer, and in those final months, she made me promise to keep her memory alive for my younger brother Marcus and myself. What I didn't expect was how quickly my father would move on, or how determined his new wife would be to erase every trace of the woman who came before her. The house I grew up in feels like a stranger's home now, filled with Jessica's modern furniture and her cold, sterile decorating choices that have systematically replaced every warm touch my mother ever added. Growing up in the suburbs of Denver, Colorado, our family home on Maple Street was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's names and children played freely in backyards until the streetlights came on. My mother Elena was the heart of our house, always humming while she cooked Sunday dinners, tending to her rose garden that bloomed magnificently every spring, and creating traditions that made our ordinary lives feel magical. She had this way of making everyone feel special, whether it was packing elaborate lunches with little notes for Marcus and me, or staying up late helping us with school projects that always seemed impossible, until she appeared with her gentle guidance and endless patience. My father David worked long hours as a regional sales manager for a pharmaceutical company, traveling frequently throughout the mountain states. He was a good provider and loved us in his quiet, reserved way, but he often seemed like a guest in his own home, content to let my mother handle the emotional heavy lifting of family life. When he was home, he'd retreat to his study after dinner, catching up on paperwork or watching the news, while Mom would help us with homework at the kitchen table, or read bedtime stories in voices that brought every character to life. I remember thinking as a child that my parents had found the perfect balance, with Mom providing the warmth and Dad providing the stability, never realizing how much weight my mother was carrying alone. The first signs of my mother's illness appeared during my junior year at Colorado State University, where I was studying graphic design with dreams of working for a major advertising agency. She mentioned feeling tired more often, dismissing it as the natural consequence of approaching 50 and managing a household. When she found the lump during a routine self-examination, she waited 2 weeks before telling anyone, not wanting to worry the family unnecessarily. By the time she finally shared the news, the cancer had already begun its relentless advance, and our lives shifted into a rhythm of doctor appointments, treatment schedules, and the kind of hope that feels both essential and fragile. I transferred to the University of Colorado Denver campus to be closer to home during her treatment, commuting daily so I could help with appointments and spend time with her between classes. Marcus was only 15 then, a sophomore in high school, who responded to the crisis by throwing himself into basketball and avoiding conversations about Mom's condition. Dad struggled with the helplessness that comes with watching someone you love fight a battle you can't join, channeling his anxiety into researching treatments and maintaining detailed calendars of medications and appointments. The 2 years of my mother's illness taught me things about strength and grace that no classroom ever could. She faced every setback with a dignity that inspired everyone around her, from the nurses who competed to be assigned to her care, to the other patients in the chemotherapy ward who sought her out for encouragement. Even as the treatments took their toll, she insisted on maintaining as much normalcy as possible, continuing to cook when she had energy, attending Marcus's basketball games wrapped in colorful scarves, and planning family activities that created precious memories during an impossible time. During her final months, when it became clear that the treatments were no longer working, my mother focused on what she called finishing well. She spent hours organizing family photos, writing letters for Marcus and me to open on future birthdays and milestones, and recording video messages on my laptop for occasions she knew she wouldn't be there to celebrate. She also began having serious conversations with each of us about life after she was gone, conversations that felt both premature and necessary. The talk she had with me on a snowy February afternoon remains etched in my memory with crystalline clarity. We were sitting in her bedroom, which had become her sanctuary during the worst days, surrounded by the things that defined her life. Family photos covering every surface, her jewelry box with the musical ballerina that had fascinated me as a child, stacks of romance novels with worn covers and the quilt her grandmother had made as a wedding gift. The winter light filtering through her lace curtains cast everything in a soft ethereal glow that made the moment feel suspended in time. "Sarah, honey," she said, her voice carrying the weakness that had become increasingly pronounced. "I need you to promise me something important." She reached for my hand with fingers that felt papery and cold despite the warmth of the room. "When I'm gone, your father is going to need time to grieve, and he might make decisions that seem strange or hurtful. You have to remember that people process loss differently, and his way might not look like yours or Marcus." I wanted to protest, to insist that we didn't need to have this conversation yet, but something in her expression told me this was important in ways I couldn't fully understand. "What are you asking me to promise, Mom?" I managed to say through the tightness in my throat. "Promise me that you'll take care of the things that matter," she continued, gesturing around the room with a weak smile. "Not everything, because things are just things, but the pieces that hold our family's story. The photo albums, my jewelry that belonged to my mother and grandmother, the recipe cards with my handwriting that you and Marcus will want someday. Your father won't think about these things because they don't mean to him what they mean to us, and that's okay. Men often don't understand the importance of preserving the small details that make a family's history real." She paused to rest, the conversation clearly exhausting her, but her grip on my hand tightened slightly. "And Sarah, if your father finds someone new eventually, please try to understand that it won't mean he loved me less. It will mean he learned how to love from being married to me, and he can't bear being alone with that love and nowhere to put. But you might need to protect our family's memories if his new person doesn't understand their importance." At 25, I thought I understood what she was telling me, but I couldn't have imagined the specific ways her words would prove prophetic. I promised her I would protect what mattered, thinking I was agreeing to safeguard photo albums and recipe cards, not realizing I was accepting responsibility for preserving the essence of who we had been as a family when she was alive. My mother passed away on a Tuesday morning in early April, surrounded by the three people who loved her most. The funeral was everything she would have wanted: simple, elegant, and filled with flowers from her beloved garden that my father had somehow managed to coax into early bloom. The church overflowed with people whose lives she had touched, from childhood friends to the nurses who had cared for her, each sharing stories that painted a picture of a woman who had made the world brighter simply by being in. In the immediate aftermath of her death, our house became a shrine to grief and memory. My father moved through the days like a man underwater, handling necessary arrangements with mechanical efficiency while struggling with simple decisions like what to eat for dinner. Marcus retreated into his senior year of high school and college preparations, using the busyness of normal teenage life to avoid confronting the enormity of our loss. I found myself trying to hold everything together, managing thank you notes and condolence gifts while navigating my own grief and finishing my final semester of college. For the first year after Mom's death, we all seemed frozen in place, going through the motions of living while privately trying to figure out how to exist without the person who had been our family's gravitational center. Dad threw himself into work with renewed intensity, accepting assignments that required even more travel than before. Marcus graduated and left for Colorado State University on a partial basketball scholarship, eager to start fresh somewhere that didn't constantly remind him of what he'd lost. I moved to Boulder after graduation, landing a position with a small marketing firm that specialized in nonprofit work, drawn to the idea of using my skills for organizations that made a difference. The second year brought subtle changes that I initially interpreted as healing. Dad began taking better care of himself, updating his wardrobe and joining a gym. He started accepting social invitations from colleagues, and seemed more present during our weekly family dinners, which had become sacred obligations we all honored despite the ghost of Mom's absence at every gathering. Marcus was thriving in college, finding his footing both academically and socially, though he still avoided talking about anything related to our mother's memory. It was during the beginning of the third year that Dad mentioned he had started dating someone. Her name was Jessica, he told Marcus and me over dinner at our usual restaurant, and she was a pharmaceutical sales representative he had met at a conference in Phoenix. They had been seeing each other for a few months, he explained with the careful tone of someone delivering potentially explosive news, and he wanted us to meet her when we felt ready. Marcus shrugged with the casual indifference of a 19-year-old who had his own life to focus on, but I felt a complex mix of emotions that I struggled to untangle. Part of me was genuinely happy that Dad had found companionship after 2 years of profound loneliness. Another part felt protective of my mother's memory and worried about how this new relationship might change our family dynamic. But mostly I felt unprepared for the reality of sharing my father with someone who hadn't known and loved my mother, someone who would inevitably view our family's history as baggage rather than treasure. I first met Jessica on a sunny Saturday in October when Dad invited us for what he called a casual barbecue at the house. She was everything my mother had not been: tall where Mom had been petite, platinum blonde where Mom had been brunette, sharply dressed in designer clothes, where Mom had favored comfortable, practical clothes. Jessica worked in pharmaceutical sales like Dad, spoke confidently about market strategies and client relationships. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And seemed to view the world through the lens of efficiency and result. During that initial meeting, Jessica was polite and appropriately interested in learning about Marcus and me, asking the kind of questions that suggested she had prepared for the encounter. She complimented the house, though I noticed her eyes lingering on features that she clearly found outdated: the floral wallpaper in the dining room that Mom had chosen, the collection of ceramic figurines that had belonged to my grandmother, the family photos that covered every available surface. Her comments were diplomatically phrased, but I sensed an underlying assessment taking place, as if she were mentally cataloging changes she would make given the opportunity. What struck me most about Jessica was her apparent lack of curiosity about my mother. While Marcus and I shared stories naturally triggered by being in the house where we'd grown up, Jessica listened politely but never asked follow-up questions or expressed interest in learning more about the woman who had shaped our family. It was as if she had mentally filed Elena under previous chapter and was focused entirely on writing the next one. Over the following months, as Dad and Jessica's relationship became more serious, I began to notice changes in our family home that felt like tiny erasures of my mother's presence. The floral dish towels Mom had made were replaced with plain white ones. Her collection of cookbooks disappeared from the kitchen counter, replaced by a sleek coffee machine that Jessica had given Dad for his birthday. The refrigerator, once covered with family photos and Marcus's childhood artwork, was cleared and maintained in pristine, undecorated condition. Dad seemed happier than he had been since Mom's death, and I tried to focus on that positive development rather than my growing unease about the subtle changes. Jessica made him laugh, encouraged him to try new restaurants and activities, and brought a social energy to his life that had been missing during his years of grief. When he told us they were planning to move in together, I forced myself to be supportive, reasoning that Dad deserved happiness and companionship after the loneliness he had endured. The decision to sell the family house felt like a logical step that I wasn't prepared for emotionally. Dad explained the house was too big for one person, and too filled with memories for Jessica to ever feel comfortable there. They had found a beautiful townhouse in a newer development across town, he told us, and the proceeds from selling our childhood home would help secure their financial future together. Marcus was surprisingly philosophical about the decision, pointing out that he rarely came home from college anyway, and would soon be establishing his own adult life. But for me, the thought of strangers living in the house where my mother had died, where every room held irreplaceable memories, felt like a betrayal I couldn't articulate without sounding selfish. Jessica took charge of preparing the house for sale with the kind of ruthless efficiency she brought to everything else. She hired professional stagers who removed most of our family photos and personal belongings, replacing them with generic artwork and neutral decorative objects designed to help potential buyers envision themselves in this. Our lived-in family home was transformed into a beautiful but soulless showcase that bore little resemblance to the warm, welcoming place where I had grown up. During this process, Jessica assured me that all of our family belongings would be carefully packed and stored until we could decide what to keep and what to donate. She even offered to help me go through my mother's things, saying she understood how difficult it must be to make those decisions alone. At the time, I appreciated her thoughtfulness and felt guilty about my initial reservations about her relationship with Dad. She seemed to be making an effort to honor our family's history while helping Dad move forward with his life. The house sold quickly to a young family with twin toddlers, and Dad and Jessica moved into their new townhouse the weekend before Thanksgiving. They invited Marcus and me for Thanksgiving dinner in their new space, eager to establish new traditions that would mark their life together. The townhouse was beautiful, modern, spotless, and decorated in Jessica's preferred style of clean lines and neutral color. But walking through those unfamiliar rooms, I felt like a guest in my father's life, rather than his daughter coming home for the holidays. Jessica had prepared an elaborate meal that showcased her cooking skills, which were considerably more sophisticated than my mother's had been. Everything was perfectly seasoned and beautifully presented, and she had clearly put tremendous effort into making the day special. But something felt performative about the entire experience, as if we were all playing roles in Jessica's vision of what a blended family should look like rather than simply being ourselves together. After dinner, when Marcus and Dad were watching football in the living room, Jessica asked if I would like to see the room she had designated as a study, where she had placed some of our family belongings that didn't fit with their new decorating scheme. She led me to a small bedroom that had been converted into an office space, pointing to several boxes stacked in the closet and a few items arranged on a bookshelf. "I saved the things I thought might be important to you and Marcus," she said, gesturing toward the boxes with what seemed like genuine care. "The photo albums, some of your mother's jewelry, a few pieces of her china. I wasn't sure what else you might want, so I kept anything that seemed sentimental." I thanked her for being so thoughtful, though something about the way she referred to my mother's belongings as things I might want, rather than family heirlooms, felt subtly dismissive. But she had made an effort to preserve what mattered, and I appreciated that she hadn't simply disposed of everything without asking. I made a mental note to go through the boxes soon and take home anything that felt particularly precious. The holidays passed peacefully, and I began to settle into the new reality of our reconfigured family. Dad seemed genuinely content in his new life with Jessica, and she continued to be pleasant and welcoming toward Marcus and me, even if our relationship never developed the warmth I had hoped for. I focused on my own career and social life in Boulder, dating occasionally and building friendships with colleagues and neighbors. The grief over my mother's death had softened into a manageable sadness that I carried quietly, bringing out memories of her during private moments when I needed to feel connected to who I had been when she was alive. It was during the spring of their second year living together that Jessica began making comments about the need to declutter their space further. She mentioned that the boxes of family items in the study were taking up room they needed for other purposes, and she suggested that Marcus and I should probably decide what we actually wanted to keep rather than storing everything indefinitely. Her tone was reasonable and practical, but I detected an underlying impatience with our failure to deal with these remnants of our previous family life. I promised to come over soon and go through everything, but between work deadlines and my own busy life, I kept postponing the task. The boxes felt like a responsibility I wasn't quite ready to handle, requiring emotional energy I didn't always have available. Jessica's periodic reminders became slightly more pointed over time, though she was always careful to frame her requests in terms of helping us rather than pressuring us. The issue came to a head during a family dinner in late May when Jessica mentioned that they were planning to renovate the study into a proper guest room for visiting relatives. "It would be wonderful to have Marcus stay here when he's home from college instead of him having to find other accommodations," she said, smiling at him warmly. "But we'll need to clear out the storage situation first so we can plan the renovation properly." Marcus, who had been staying with friends or occasionally in my guest room when he visited, seemed pleased with the prospect of having a designated space at Dad's house, but I felt a familiar anxiety about the implied deadline for dealing with my mother's belongings. "I'll come over this weekend and take care of everything," I promised, though part of me dreaded the emotional challenge of sorting through the physical remnants of my mother's life. "Perfect," Jessica said brightly. I'll make sure everything is easily accessible for you, and I can help if you need another perspective on what's worth keeping. That weekend I drove to Dad and Jessica's townhouse with empty boxes in my car and what I thought was sufficient emotional preparation for the task ahead. Dad was playing golf with colleagues, leaving Jessica and me to handle the sorting process together. She had already pulled all the boxes from the closet and arranged them in the study, along with a few items that had been displayed on the bookshelf. I tried to organize things roughly by category, Jessica explained as I surveyed the collection. Photo albums in that box, jewelry and small personal items in this one, some clothing and linens in the larger box. I wasn't sure about some of the papers and books, so I put those together separately. I started with the photo albums, immediately transported back to childhood memories as I flipped through pages of family vacations, birthday celebrations, and ordinary moments that my mother had considered worth preserving. Jessica watched from across the room, occasionally commenting on pictures where she recognized Dad or could identify younger versions of Marcus and me, but her interest seemed polite rather than genuine, and I found myself wanting to explain the stories behind the images to someone who would understand their significance. The jewelry box contained treasures that told the story of the women in my family: my great-grandmother's wedding ring, my grandmother's pearl earrings, my mother's modest but meaningful collection of pieces that Dad had given her over the years. Jessica made appropriate appreciative sounds as I showed her various items, but I could tell she didn't understand their emotional weight. These weren't valuable pieces in monetary terms, but they represented connections across generations that couldn't be replaced or replicated. The box of papers and books proved more challenging to sort through, containing everything from my mother's high school yearbook to greeting cards Dad had given her throughout their marriage. Mixed in with clearly sentimental items were practical documents like warranties for appliances they no longer owned, and instruction manuals for electronics that had long since been replaced. Jessica's impatience became more apparent as I lingered over letters and cards, reading pieces of my parents' love story that I had never seen before. Maybe we could separate the truly important papers from the general household stuff, Jessica suggested after watching me read through a stack of anniversary cards. I hate to see you spending time on things that aren't really worth keeping. Her comment stung more than I expected, though I recognized she was trying to be helpful. But these things that aren't really worth keeping contained the intimate details of my parents' relationship, evidence of the love story that had created our family. To Jessica, they were clutter interfering with her renovation plans. To me, they were irreplaceable glimpses into my mother's private emotional life. I finished the sorting process, feeling emotionally drained and slightly resentful of Jessica's presence during such a personal task. She had been helpful in practical ways, providing boxes and tape and offering to carry heavy items to my car, but her inability to understand why I needed to read every card or examine every small object made me feel rushed through a process that deserved more time and reverence. As I loaded my car with the items I had chosen to keep, Jessica stood in the driveway making friendly conversation about the upcoming renovation and her excitement about creating a proper guest space. "It's going to be so nice to have a room specifically designed for family visits," she said. "I want Marcus and you to always feel welcome here, and having a real guest room instead of a storage area will make such a difference." I thanked her for her thoughtfulness while privately wondering why she assumed that clearing away my mother's belongings would make me feel more welcome in their home. But I kept these thoughts to myself, recognizing that Jessica was trying to build a relationship with her new family and deserved credit for making the effort, even if her approach felt tone-deaf to my emotional needs. Driving home to Boulder with my car full of my mother's things, I felt like I was carrying the weight of our family's history alone. Marcus was busy with college life, and seemed content to let me handle the responsibility of preserving our mother's memory. Dad had moved forward with his new life, and appeared grateful that someone else was managing the practical details of his previous life. Jessica meant well but couldn't understand the significance of what she saw as outdated clutter interfering with their fresh start together. That evening, I called Marcus to tell him about the sorting process, and offer him first choice of anything I had brought home. He was preparing for final exams and seemed distracted, thanking me for handling everything, and promising to look through the items when he was home for summer break. "Just keep whatever you think is important, Sarah," he said with the casual trust of someone who knows his sister will make thoughtful decisions. "You're better at that sentimental stuff than I am anyway." His response left me feeling even more alone with the responsibility of preserving our family's emotional legacy. It seemed that I was the only one who understood the importance of maintaining connections to our life before Jessica, the only one who felt the weight of my mother's final request to protect what mattered. Everyone else was ready to move forward while I remained anchored to a past that was slipping away despite my efforts to hold on to it. Over the next few months, I tried to settle into the new normal of our rearranged family dynamic. Dad and Jessica seemed happy in their renovated space, frequently hosting dinner parties and social gatherings that showcased their beautiful home and domestic partnership. Marcus spent the summer traveling with friends before returning to college for his junior year, visiting our father's house occasionally, but maintaining his emotional distance from family complexity. I continued my work in Boulder and began dating a colleague named Tom, finding comfort in building something new while privately treasuring the pieces of my mother's life I had rescued from Jessica's well-intentioned efficiency. But the sense of loss I felt went deeper than grief over my mother's death. It was a growing awareness that the family I had known was being systematically erased, replaced by Jessica's vision of what a modern, forward-looking household should be. The traditions my mother had established, the stories that defined our shared history, the small rituals that had made us who we were, all of these were being quietly abandoned in favor of Jessica's preferences and standards. The final straw came on what would have been my mother's 52nd birthday in September. I had planned to visit Dad and Jessica for a quiet dinner, perhaps sharing some favorite memories of Mom and acknowledging the significance of the day. When I arrived at their townhouse, I found them preparing for a party they were hosting for Jessica's colleagues, the house decorated with elegant fall arrangements and catered appetizers laid out on my mother's good china. "Oh, Sarah, perfect timing," Jessica said, as I stood in the doorway holding a small bouquet of roses from my mother's favorite variety. "We're having some people over tonight, but you're welcome to stay if you'd like to meet everyone. They're lovely people, and I think you'd enjoy the conversation." I realized that Jessica had no idea what day it was, no awareness that she was using my mother's dishes to serve strangers on the anniversary of her birth. Dad was in the kitchen arranging wine glasses, dressed in a new shirt I didn't recognize, looking forward to an evening of socializing with his new crowd of friends. It was clear that September 15th had become just another date on the calendar, stripped of the meaning it had held when my mother was alive to mark it. I made an excuse about having other plans and left quickly, driving home with tears blurring my vision and a growing certainty that something essential was being lost in the process of everyone else moving on. That night, I sat in my apartment surrounded by the photo albums and jewelry I had rescued from Jessica's renovation, feeling like the sole guardian of memories that no one else seemed to value. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in November while I was reviewing campaign proposals for a new client. Jessica's voice sounded strained and artificially cheerful as she explained that she and Dad had decided to do some early spring cleaning before the holiday. They were going through the remaining storage areas and had found several more boxes of items that belonged to our family's previous life together. Would I be able to come by that weekend to collect anything I wanted before they donated the rest to charity? Something in her tone set off alarm bells, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly what felt wrong about the conversation. Jessica had always been meticulous about giving us advance notice before disposing of anything that might have sentimental value, so her approach seemed consistent with her previous behavior. Yet there was an urgency beneath her polite words that hadn't been there during our earlier conversations about my mother's belongings. I agreed to come by on Saturday afternoon, already dreading another emotional archaeology session through the remnants of my childhood. Since our last sorting experience in the spring, I had been more intentional about visiting Dad and Jessica regularly, trying to maintain family connections despite the growing sense that I was an outsider in their new life together. These visits had become exercises in careful navigation, avoiding topics that might highlight the differences between their current happiness and our previous family dynamics. During my October visit, I had noticed that even more traces of my mother's influence had disappeared from their home. The set of everyday dishes that Mom had chosen for our family kitchen had been replaced with a sleek white dinnerware collection that Jessica preferred. The wooden recipe box that had sat on our kitchen counter for my entire childhood was nowhere to be seen, though Jessica assured me it was safely stored somewhere when I asked about it casually. Small changes continued to accumulate, each one insignificant on its own, but collectively creating an environment where my mother's memory felt increasingly unwelcome. Tom, the colleague I had been dating for several months, had started to notice my mood changes after these family visits. He was a thoughtful man who worked in nonprofit communications, someone who understood the importance of preserving institutional memory and honoring the past while building toward the future. When I described my growing unease about Jessica's systematic removal of my mother's presence from Dad's life, Tom listened with the kind of attention that made me feel heard rather than judged. "It sounds like she's trying to create a clean slate for their relationship," he observed after I recounted my latest visit. "That's not necessarily malicious, but it might not leave room for the complexity of blended family dynamic." His perspective helped me understand that Jessica's actions might stem from insecurity rather than malice. Perhaps she felt threatened by reminders of the deep love Dad had shared with my mother. Or maybe she genuinely believed that moving forward required leaving the past behind. But understanding her motivations didn't make the results any less painful for Marcus and me, or any less disrespectful to my mother's memory. The week leading up to my Saturday visit to collect more family items was particularly stressful at work. Our marketing firm had landed a major contract with a statewide environmental nonprofit, and I was leading the team developing their annual fundraising campaign. The project required long hours and creative problem-solving, exactly the kind of work that usually energized me. But I found myself distracted by anxiety about what Jessica might have discovered in her latest round of organizational efficiency. Friday evening, I called Marcus at college to let him know about the weekend plans and ask if there was anything specific he wanted me to look for. He was in the middle of midterm exams and sounded exhausted, but he took time to think seriously about my question. "See if you can find Mom's recipe cards," he said finally. "I know that sounds weird, but I was thinking the other day about those chocolate chip cookies she used to make when we were sick. I tried to recreate them from memory, but they didn't taste right." The request surprised me because Marcus rarely expressed interest in maintaining connections to our mother's daily life. But it also reminded me that his grief took different forms than mine, often surfacing unexpectedly around specific sensory memories, rather than through the constant low-level sadness I carry. I promised to prioritize finding the recipe cards, though I worried they might have been discarded during one of Jessica's previous organizing sessions. Saturday morning dawned gray and cold, with the kind of November weather that makes everything feel more difficult than it should. I drove to Dad and Jessica's townhouse with my usual collection of empty boxes and a growing sense of dread that I couldn't shake. Something about Jessica's phone call earlier in the week had felt different, more final somehow, as if this might be my last opportunity to claim anything from our family's previous life. Dad answered the door with a distracted smile, explaining that he was in the middle of watching a college football game, but would be available to help if I needed anything heavy moved. Jessica appeared from the kitchen wearing rubber gloves and an apron, clearly in the middle of serious cleaning projects. The house smelled like lemon-scented disinfectant, and had the kind of sparkling cleanliness that suggested a major organizational effort was underway. "Perfect timing, Sarah," Jessica said, pulling off her gloves and leading me toward the basement. "I found several boxes down here that I somehow missed during our previous cleanup. I think there might be some things you'll want to keep, but honestly, some of it looks like it should have been thrown away years ago." The basement had been converted into a finished recreation area with a large screen television, comfortable seating, and built-in storage cabinets along one wall. Jessica led me to a corner where 4 or 5 boxes sat alongside several black garbage bags that appeared to be full of discarded items. The setup immediately struck me as ominous, as if the division between possibly valuable and definitely trash had already been made without my input. "I tried to be conservative about what went into the donation bags," Jessica explained, gesturing toward the black bags. "Just things that were obviously damaged or outdated. But I wanted you to go through everything before we make the final trip to Goodwill." I approached the boxes with growing apprehension, immediately noticing that they looked different from the carefully packed containers I had sorted through during previous sessions. These boxes appeared to have been packed hastily, with items jumbled together rather than organized by category or significance. The first box I opened contained a mixture of Christmas decorations, kitchen utensils, and random household items that seemed to have been gathered quickly rather than thoughtfully preserved. Digging deeper into the first box, I found my mother's set of holiday cookie cutters, wrapped carelessly in newspaper, their delicate shapes bent and scratched from improper storage. Beneath them were several of her favorite serving dishes, including the ceramic turkey platter she had used every Thanksgiving throughout my childhood. Seeing these items treated as disposable clutter rather than family treasures sent a spike of anger through my chest that I struggled to control. The second box contained more concerning discoveries. My mother's jewelry box, which I had specifically requested during our previous sorting session, sat at the bottom beneath a pile of old linen. When I lifted it out, I realized that many of the small compartments were empty, the delicate pieces apparently removed and stored elsewhere, or possibly lost during the careless packing process. The musical mechanism that had played a gentle waltz when the lid opened was broken, the tiny ballerina frozen in mid-pirouette. "Where are the rest of my mother's jewelry pieces?" I asked Jessica, trying to keep my voice level despite the growing alarm I felt. Jessica looked genuinely confused, moving closer to examine the jewelry box. "I thought everything was in there when I packed it," she said. "Maybe some pieces fell out during the move. I'm sure we can find them if we look through the other boxes." But as I continued searching through the remaining containers, it became clear that many important items were missing entirely. The wooden recipe box that Marcus had specifically requested was nowhere to be found. My mother's collection of classic novels, books she had owned since college and annotated with her thoughts and favorite passages, had vanished completely. Even some of the photo albums I remembered seeing during previous visits seemed to have disappeared. "Jessica, where are my mother's books?" I asked, no longer able to maintain a casual tone. "And her recipe box? I know those were here before because I saw them." Jessica's expression shifted to something I had never seen from her before, a combination of defensiveness and irritation that she quickly tried to mask with concerned confusion. "Oh, the books," she said, as if suddenly remembering. "Some of them were in pretty bad condition, water damaged, or with pages falling out. I thought they were beyond saving, so they went into the donation pile weeks ago." I should have mentioned that when we talked, the casual dismissal of my mother's beloved books felt like a physical blow. These weren't random paperbacks that could be easily replaced, but carefully chosen volumes that contained my mother's marginalia and bookmarks, evidence of her intellectual life and personal growth over decades. The idea that Jessica had deemed them beyond saving, without consulting me, revealed an attitude toward our family's history that I was only beginning to fully understand. "What about the recipe box?" I pressed, my composure beginning to crack despite my efforts to remain diplomatic. Jessica hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting away from mine before she answered. "I think that might have gotten mixed up with some other kitchen items that we donated earlier this fall. I remember seeing a wooden box, but I thought it was just an old storage container. I didn't realize it had sentimental value." The explanation felt rehearsed and incomplete, but I couldn't prove that Jessica was being deliberately deceptive rather than carelessly thoughtless. Either way, the result was the same. Irreplaceable pieces of my mother's daily life had been discarded without any consideration for their importance to Marcus and me. I felt a surge of grief and rage that was difficult to contain, complicated by the realization that I was standing in someone else's home and couldn't express my true feelings without creating a scene that would damage my relationship with Dad. I turned my attention to the black garbage bags that Jessica had prepared for donation, desperately hoping to find some of the missing items before they disappeared forever. The first bag contained mostly old clothing and linens, but the second bag revealed discoveries that made my heart race with panic and fear. My mother's wedding dress, the elegant vintage gown she had worn when she married Dad and had carefully preserved for nearly 30 years, was crumpled at the bottom of the bag beneath a pile of old towels, Why is my mother's wedding dress in a donation bag? I asked, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. Jessica looked genuinely surprised when I pulled the dress from the bag, though whether her surprise was at the dress's presence or my discovery of it was unclear. "Oh my goodness, I have no idea how that got in there," she said, reaching for the dress with what appeared to be sincere concern. "It must have been mixed in by mistake. I would never have put something that important in the donation pile intentionally." But as I examined the dress more closely, I noticed that it had been handled roughly, with new stains and wrinkles that suggested it hadn't been carefully stored. More disturbing was the realization that someone had to have made a deliberate decision to remove it from whatever protective garment bag my mother had used to preserve it. Wedding dresses don't accidentally end up in donation piles. They require intentional handling and specific decisions about their fate. The third garbage bag contained even more shocking discovery. My mother's handwritten recipe cards, the ones Marcus had specifically asked me to find, were scattered loose in the bag, some torn and stained from contact with other discarded items. Mixed in with them were family photos that had been removed from their frames, including several pictures of my parents' wedding day, and my mother holding Marcus and me as babies. These weren't duplicates or casual snapshots, but irreplaceable images that documented the most important moments of our family's history. I sat back on my heels in the basement, surrounded by garbage bags full of my mother's most precious belongings, struggling to comprehend how such important items had ended up destined for donation. The careful preservation my mother had practiced throughout her life, the thoughtful way she had maintained family treasures and documented our shared history, had been reduced to clutter awaiting disposal. Every item I rescued from those bags felt like evidence of a systematic erasure that went far beyond normal household organization. "There seems to have been some kind of mistake," I said to Jessica, no longer able to pretend that these discoveries were acceptable accidents. "These are irreplaceable family heirlooms, not random household items. How did they end up in donation bags?" Jessica's demeanor shifted noticeably, the helpful friendliness replaced by barely concealed annoyance. "Sarah, I understand you're upset, but you have to realize that we can't keep everything forever," she said with the kind of patience typically reserved for unreasonable children. "Your father and I have been living with boxes of memories from his previous life for over 2 years now. At some point we need to move forward instead of being museum curators for the past." The phrase "his previous life" hit me like a slap, reducing my mother's existence and our family's history to something my father had lived through rather than something that remained part of who he was. But even more shocking was Jessica's casual admission that she viewed my mother's belongings as obstacles to her happiness, rather than treasures worth preserving for the next generation. "These aren't just random memories," I said, my voice shaking with suppressed anger. "This is my mother's wedding dress, family photos, recipe cards she wrote by hand. These are irreplaceable pieces of our family's history." Jessica's expression hardened further, revealing an attitude I had never seen from her before. "Your family's history," she repeated, emphasizing the possessive pronoun in a way that made clear I wasn't including her in that definition. "Sarah, I've tried to be respectful of your feelings about your mother, but at some point you need to accept that your father has moved on. He's built a new life, and holding on to every scrap of paper from his first marriage isn't healthy for anyone." The conversation had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, revealing Jessica's true feelings about my mother's memory and my efforts to preserve. For over 2 years she had maintained a facade of understanding and accommodation, while apparently growing increasingly resentful of the emotional space my mother continued to occupy in our family. The careful politeness that had characterized our interactions was finally giving way to her genuine frustration with having to compete with a dead woman for primacy in Dad's life. "Does my father know you were planning to donate my mother's wedding dress?" I asked, trying to understand how much Dad was aware of Jessica's disposal decisions. Jessica hesitated, and in that pause I glimpsed the answer she didn't want to give directly. "Your father has given me complete authority to handle household organization," she said finally. "He trusts my judgment about what's worth keeping and what's taking up unnecessary space." The implication was clear. Dad had either explicitly approved of Jessica's aggressive purging of my mother's belongings, or he had deliberately chosen not to know the details of what was being discarded. Either possibility felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than Jessica's actions alone. My father, who had been married to my mother for over 20 years and had grieved her loss deeply, was allowing someone else to erase the physical evidence of their shared life together. I spent the next hour methodically going through every bag and box, rescuing items that Jessica had deemed disposable while fighting back tears of rage and heartbreak. My mother's favorite cookbook, annotated with her modifications and notes about which recipes we had enjoyed as a family, had been saved only because it was wedged between two other books Jessica had apparently decided to keep. A small framed photo of my parents on their honeymoon had been removed from its frame and tossed loose into a bag, though the frame itself was nowhere to be found. Each discovery felt like evidence of a deliberate campaign to eliminate my mother's influence from Dad's new life. These weren't the inevitable casualties of normal household management, but targeted removals of items that specifically connected to my mother's identity and our family's shared history. Jessica had apparently spent months identifying and disposing of anything that reminded her of the woman who had come before her, all while maintaining the pretense of being respectful and accommodating to Dad's children. As I loaded my car with rescued treasures, Jessica stood in the driveway making conversation that felt surreal given what had just transpired in the basement. She talked about their upcoming holiday plans, their excitement about hosting Christmas dinner for the first time, and her hope that Marcus and I would be able to join them for the celebration. Her tone was friendly and normal, as if we hadn't just had a conversation that revealed her true feelings about my mother's memory and my role in their family. "I'm sorry there was so much confusion about which items were being donated," Jessica said as I arranged boxes in my car. "I really thought I had been more careful about separating family treasures from general household items." The apology felt hollow and performative, offered more to maintain appearances than from genuine remorse. But I accepted it with a neutral acknowledgement, recognizing that any other response would likely result in conflict that would ultimately damage my relationship with Dad. I was beginning to understand that Jessica's pleasant facade was a strategic choice rather than an expression of her genuine feelings, and that challenging her directly would only make her more skilled at hiding her true intention. During the drive home to Boulder, I found myself shaking with a combination of anger and grief that was difficult to process. The rescue mission had been successful in saving many irreplaceable items, but it had also revealed the extent of what had already been lost and the deliberate nature of those losses. More disturbing was the realization that Dad had either actively participated in, or willfully ignored Jessica's systematic disposal of my mother's belongings. That evening I called Marcus to tell him about the day's discoveries, including the fact that I had found some of Mom's recipe cards, but many were damaged or missing entirely. His reaction was stronger than I had expected, with a long silence followed by language that revealed depths of anger I rarely heard from my generally easygoing brother. "She threw away Mom's recipe box," he said, his voice tight with controlled fear. "The one with all the family recipes Mom learned from Grandma, Sarah. That thing was irreplaceable." I could hear the pain beneath his anger, the realization that connections to our mother's family traditions had been severed without his knowledge or consent. Marcus had always processed grief differently than I did, often seeming to move forward without dwelling on loss, but the destruction of tangible links to our mother's daily life apparently affected him more deeply than he typically expected. "I saved what I could," I told him, "but some of the cards were torn or stained. I'll try to piece together what's salvageable and make copies of everything." "It's not the same though," Marcus said quietly. "Those cards had Mom's handwriting on them, her notes about modifications she made to the recipes. They were like having conversations with her when I was trying to cook something she used to make." His words perfectly captured what Jessica didn't understand about the items she had so casually discarded. These weren't just old papers taking up space, but continuing connections to our mother's presence in our daily lives. The recipe cards allowed Marcus to cook meals that tasted like home, surrounded by the invisible presence of the woman who had created those flavor memories. Destroying them was like severing the last tangible threads that connected us to the domestic life she had built for our family. We talked for over an hour that night, sharing memories triggered by the items I had rescued, and grieving together for the things that had been lost forever. It was the most honest conversation Marcus and I had shared about our mother's death since the immediate aftermath of her funeral, and I realized that we had both been carrying private griefs that were easier to bear when shared. "What are you going to do about Jessica?" Marcus asked as our conversation wound down. I didn't have a good answer to his question. Confronting her directly seemed likely to result in even more aggressive disposal of anything she viewed as threatening to her territory. Talking to Dad meant forcing him to choose between his new wife's comfort and his children's emotional needs, a conversation that could damage our relationship permanently. But doing nothing felt like accepting that my mother's memory would continue to be erased until nothing remained of the woman who had shaped our family for over 2 decades. The next few days at work were difficult, as I struggled to concentrate on campaigns and client meetings while processing the emotional aftermath of my discovery. Tom noticed my distraction and eventually convinced me to tell him what had happened during my weekend visit to Dad's house. His reaction was immediate and visceral. As someone who worked in nonprofit communications, he understood the importance of preserving institutional memory, and the damage that could be done by well-intentioned people who didn't understand what they were destroying. "This isn't just about sentiment," he said after I finished describing Jessica's actions. "She's destroying primary source documents of your family's history. Future generations won't have access to those recipes, those photos, those personal artifacts that tell the story of who you were as a family." His perspective helped me understand why the losses felt so devastating beyond my personal grief. Jessica wasn't just disposing of my mother's belongings, she was editing our family's narrative to exclude the chapters that made her uncomfortable. The recipe cards Marcus wanted weren't just instructions for making cookies, but documentation of how our mother had adapted traditional recipes to suit our family's tastes and dietary needs. The annotated books weren't just novels, but records of our mother's intellectual development and the ideas that had shaped her worldview. I began to realize that my mother's final request to protect what mattered had been more prescient than I had understood at the time. She had somehow anticipated that the physical artifacts of our family life might be threatened by someone who viewed them as competition rather than treasure. But she had also given me permission to fight for their preservation, even if that fight required difficult conversations and uncomfortable confrontations. The decision to document everything I had rescued became an urgent priority. I spent the following weekend photographing every recipe card, scanning every photo, and creating digital archives of anything that could be preserved electronically. The process was emotionally exhausting but felt like essential work, insurance against future losses that might occur despite my best efforts to protect what remained. As I worked through the boxes of rescued items, I made discoveries that reinforced my growing understanding of Jessica's motivation. Mixed in with my mother's belongings were several items that clearly belonged to Dad's life with Jessica: recent photographs, restaurant menus from their trips together, programs from events they had attended as a couple. It appeared that Jessica had been using my mother's storage boxes to organize her own memorabilia, literally replacing one woman's treasures with another's. The symbolism was too obvious to ignore. Jessica wasn't just clearing out storage space or organizing household items, she was actively substituting her own history with Dad for the history he had shared with my mother. Every space formerly occupied by evidence of my parents' marriage was being filled with proof of Dad's new relationship, a systematic replacement that went far beyond normal household management. I found myself wondering what my mother would have thought about Jessica's approach to joining our family. Mom had been generous and inclusive by nature, someone who would have welcomed a new woman into Dad's life if it meant he wouldn't be lonely after her death. But I couldn't imagine her approving of the deliberate erasure of our family's shared history, or the casual disposal of items she had carefully preserved for Marcus and me to inherit. The realization that I was carrying this burden of preservation alone began to feel overwhelming. Dad had abdicated responsibility for protecting our family's history. Marcus was too far away and too busy with college to be actively involved, and Jessica viewed my efforts as obstacles to her happiness. I was becoming the sole guardian of memories that defined who we had been as a family, a responsibility that felt both essential and isolating. 2 weeks after the basement discovery, I made a decision that surprised me with its clarity and determination. I would not continue to enable Jessica's systematic destruction of my mother's memory.
through polite silence and diplomatic acceptance. The next time she crossed a line, I would respond with the full force of my commitment to honoring my mother's final request. I didn't know what form that response would take, but I was no longer willing to watch our family's history disappear one organizational session at a time. The opportunity for that confrontation came sooner than I expected, in a way that revealed the true extent of Jessica's campaign against my mother's memory, and forced me to choose between keeping peace and keeping faith with the woman who had raised me. The phone call came on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks later, while I was in the middle of presenting a campaign proposal to our environmental nonprofit client. Jessica's voice sounded different this time, artificially bright with an undertone of excitement that immediately put me on edge. She was calling to invite me for Sunday brunch at their townhouse, she explained, because she had something special she wanted to share with the family. It's nothing dramatic, Jessica said with a laugh that sounded forced even through the phone. Just some exciting news about the house that I think you'll appreciate. Your father suggested we make it a proper family celebration. Something about her phrasing made my stomach clench with anxiety. Jessica had never organized family celebrations before, and the idea that she had exciting news about the house filled me with dread after our recent basement encounter. But refusing the invitation would require explanations I wasn't prepared to give, so I agreed to come despite my growing sense that this gathering would not be the pleasant family meal Jessica was portraying. The weekend passed slowly as I found myself imagining various scenarios for what Jessica might have planned. Had she discovered more of my mother's belongings to dispose of? Was she announcing major renovations that would eliminate the last traces of our family's previous life? Or perhaps she was planning to reveal some change to the house that would make it even less welcoming to Marcus and me. Each possibility seemed designed to further distance us from any sense of belonging in Dad's new life. Sunday morning dawned clear and crisp, with the kind of December weather that makes everything feel sharper and more intense. I drove to the townhouse with a sense of foreboding that I couldn't shake, carrying a bottle of wine and flowers that felt like diplomatic offerings, rather than genuine gifts. Jessica's invitation had specified brunch at 11, but when I arrived precisely on time, I could see through the front window that the dining room table was set with an elaborate spread that must have taken hours to prepare. Dad answered the door wearing a new sweater I didn't recognize, his expression mixing genuine pleasure at seeing me with something that looked almost like nervousness. "Sarah, perfect timing as always," he said, embracing me with what felt like extra warmth.
Jessica's been cooking since dawn. I think she's more excited about this than she's letting on. Following him into the living room, I immediately noticed that something fundamental had changed about the space since my last visit. The few remaining photographs that featured my mother had been removed from their usual spots on the side tables and bookshelves. In their place were newer framed pictures of Dad and Jessica from their various trips and social events, creating a visual narrative that began with their relationship rather than acknowledging the decades of family life that had preceded it. Jessica emerged from the kitchen wearing an apron over what was clearly a new dress, her hair and makeup styled with more care than usual. "Sarah, wonderful. You look lovely," she said, air kissing my cheek in a gesture that felt performative rather than affectionate. "I hope you're hungry because I might have gone a little overboard with the menu." The dining room table was indeed set for a feast, with multiple courses laid out on what I recognized as my mother's best china and crystal glasses. Jessica had prepared eggs Benedict, fresh fruit salad, homemade pastries, and several other dishes that showcased her considerable cooking skills. But seeing my mother's carefully preserved tableware being used for this particular occasion felt like another small violation, as if Jessica was claiming ownership not just of Dad's present, but of our family's ceremonial tradition. We settled around the table with Jessica taking the position at the head that had always been my mother's place during family meals. Dad sat to her right in his usual spot, while I was positioned across from him in what had been Marcus's chair growing up. The seating arrangement felt deliberately symbolic, with Jessica literally occupying my mother's role while relegating me to a position that emphasized my status as a child in their household rather than an equal adult family member. Conversation during the meal was carefully orchestrated by Jessica, who seemed determined to maintain an atmosphere of celebration despite the underlying tension I could feel radiating from Dad. She talked about their recent trip to wine country, their plans for redecorating the guest room, and various social events they had attended with their new circle of coupled friends. Dad contributed appropriate responses but seemed distracted, frequently glancing at me as if trying to gauge my reaction to something I hadn't yet understood. It was during dessert that Jessica finally revealed the purpose of our gathering. "Sarah, your father and I have some exciting news to share," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze Dad's hand in a gesture that looked rehearsed. "We've decided to put the townhouse on the market and build something completely new together." The announcement hit me like a physical blow, though I struggled to understand exactly why the news felt so devastating. Dad and Jessica were adults who had every right to make housing decisions that suited their lifestyle and preference, but something about the timing and presentation of this information, combined with Jessica's recent acceleration of disposal activities, suggested that this move represented more than a simple change of address. "We found the perfect lot in a new development called Willowbrook Estates," Jessica continued, her excitement seeming more genuine now that she was sharing her actual plans. "It's about 20 minutes north of here, and we'll be able to design everything exactly the way we want it. No more living with someone else's choices or trying to work around existing layouts that don't suit our lifestyle." Dad finally spoke up, his voice carrying an apologetic tone that confirmed my suspicions about the implications of this decision. "The new house will be smaller and more manageable," he said, avoiding direct eye contact with me. "2 bedrooms instead of 3, with a more open floor plan that works better for entertaining." The message was clear even though Dad couldn't bring himself to state it direct. The new house would not include space for visiting adult children, effectively ending any pretense that Marcus and I had a place in their home or their future plan. Jessica had finally achieved her goal of creating a living situation where she and Dad could exist without any reminders of his previous family life. "What about the guest room you just finished renovating?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady despite the emotions churning in my chest. Jessica's smile remained bright, but her eyes hardened slightly at my question. "Well, we realized that we hardly ever have overnight guests," she said with practiced casualness. "It seemed silly to design a whole house around a room that gets used maybe twice a year. The new place will have a beautiful home office instead, which we'll actually use every day." The dismissal of Marcus and me as visitors who hardly ever came was particularly painful because it ignored the reality that we had been staying away more frequently due to feeling unwelcome rather than because we preferred other accommodations. Jessica had created an environment where we felt like intruders, then used our resulting absence as justification for eliminating our place in their home entirely. "When are you planning to make this move?" I asked, already dreading the answer. "We're hoping to break ground in the spring," Dad replied, his voice gaining enthusiasm as he warmed to the topic. "The house should be finished by this time next year. Jessica has some wonderful ideas for the design that I think you'll appreciate when you see the plan." I wondered what part of a house specifically designed to exclude me I was supposed to appreciate, but I kept this thought to myself while processing the implications of their timeline. A spring groundbreaking meant that they would be listing the townhouse within the next few months, creating an urgent deadline for any remaining family items that might still be stored in their current home. "What happens to the rest of the family things that are still stored here?" I asked, trying to sound casual despite the anxiety this question generated. Jessica and Dad exchanged a look that confirmed my worst fears about their plans for my mother's remaining belongings. "Actually, that's part of what we wanted to discuss with you," Jessica said, her tone shifting to what I had learned to recognize as her reasonable adult voice. "Moving to a smaller house means we really need to be selective about what we take with us. This seems like the perfect opportunity to do a final sort through everything and make sure you and Marcus have anything you truly want to keep." The phrase "truly want to keep" carried an implicit judgment about the value of my previous salvage efforts, suggesting that I had been hoarding items of questionable importance rather than preserving genuine family treasure. But more concerning was the realization that this move would give Jessica the perfect excuse to dispose of anything she found inconvenient, justified by the practical limitations of their new smaller space. "I'd like to go through everything myself," I said firmly, abandoning any pretense of diplomacy. There might be things that seem unimportant to you but have significance for Marcus and me. Jessica's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, revealing her annoyance with my lack of trust in her judgment. Of course, she said with exaggerated understanding. Though I have to say, Sarah, at some point you might want to consider whether holding on to so many material reminders of the past is really healthy. Your mother wouldn't want you to become trapped by nostalgia instead of building your own life. The presumption of speaking for my mother's wishes was infuriating, particularly coming from someone who had never known her and had spent 2 years systematically erasing her presence from our family's life. But what made Jessica's comment even more offensive was the implication that my desire to preserve family history was psychologically unhealthy rather than a natural response to grief and loss. My mother specifically asked me to protect the things that mattered to our family, I replied, my composure finally beginning to crack. I'm not trapped by nostalgia. I'm honoring her final request. Dad shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly recognizing that the conversation was moving into dangerous territory. Sarah, I think what Jessica is trying to say is that we want to make sure this transition is as smooth as possible for everyone, he said with the diplomatic tone he used when trying to diffuse family conflicts. Nobody wants to throw away anything that's truly important to you and Mark, but his attempt at mediation only highlighted the fundamental problem with their approach. Dad was treating this as a negotiation between Jessica's comfort and my sentimentality, rather than recognizing that my mother's belongings represented irreplaceable documentation of our family's history. He had apparently forgotten that these items belonged to his children by right of inheritance, not by Jessica's permission. I think we should schedule a time for me to come over and go through everything systematically, I said, trying to reassert some control over the process. Maybe Marcus can come too when he's home for winter break. Jessica's expression revealed her displeasure with this suggestion, though she quickly covered it with another bright smile. That sounds wonderful in theory, she said, but honestly, there isn't that much left. Just a few boxes in the basement storage room that somehow got overlooked during our previous organizing sessions. Something about her phrasing made me deeply suspicious. During my November rescue mission, I had carefully inventoried everything I found and noted several items that I knew existed but couldn't locate. If there were only a few boxes remaining, it meant that additional disposal had taken place without my knowledge, despite Jessica's previous promises to consult me before discarding anything else. What happened to my mother's hope chest? I asked suddenly, remembering an important item that had been missing during my last visit. The cedar chest that was in your bedroom closet. Dad's face went pale, confirming that I had stumbled onto something significant. Jessica's hesitation before answering told me everything I needed to know about the fate of that particular family treasure. The hope chest was in pretty rough condition, Jessica said finally, her voice carrying less conviction than usual. The cedar lining was splitting, and there was some water damage from where it had been stored. We decided it wasn't worth keeping, especially since most of what was inside was just old linens and baby clothes that were yellowed with age. The casual dismissal of my mother's hope chest, which had contained not just linens but family christening gowns, handmade baby quilts and other heirlooms passed down through generations of women in our family, felt like the final straw in a pattern of destruction that had gone on too long. These weren't just old linens but carefully preserved textiles that connected our family to ancestors I would never have the chance to meet. You threw away my great-grandmother's christening gown, I asked, my voice rising despite my efforts to maintain control. The one that Marcus and I both wore, and that Mom was saving for her future grandchildren. Dad reached across the table as if to calm me, but I pulled away from his touch. The realization that Jessica had disposed of irreplaceable family heirlooms while maintaining the pretense of being respectful of our feelings was more than I could bear silently. Every diplomatic conversation, every careful negotiation, every attempt to be understanding about her position, had enabled further destruction of my mother's legacy. Sarah, I understand you're upset, Dad said, his voice carrying a pleading quality I had never heard before. But you have to understand that Jessica is trying to help us move forward. Keeping every single item from the past isn't realistic when we're starting a new chapter of our lives. His words revealed that he had not only allowed but actively participated in the decision to discard family heirlooms that belonged to his children by inheritance. The man who had promised my dying mother that he would take care of Marcus and me had apparently decided that taking care of us meant enabling his new wife's campaign to erase our family history. A new chapter that doesn't include Marcus and me, I said, finally voicing the truth that had been dancing around the edges of our conversation. You're building a house with no room for your children, getting rid of anything that reminds you of our mother, and acting like the 25 years you spent as our father never happened. Jessica's mask of friendliness finally slipped completely, revealing the irritation and resentment she had been hiding behind polite conversation. Sarah, this is exactly the kind of dramatic overreaction that makes family gatherings so difficult, she said with cold precision. Your father and I are trying to build a life together, and that means making practical decisions about space and belongings. We can't organize our entire existence around preserving every scrap of paper from David's first marriage. The phrase first marriage was clearly chosen to diminish the significance of my parents' relationship, reducing 25 years of shared life to something that had simply preceded Jessica's more important claim on Dad's attention. But her admission that our family gatherings were difficult for her revealed the truth behind her previous displays of welcoming inclusivity. Those scraps of paper documented our family's history, I replied, no longer caring about maintaining diplomatic relations. They were my inheritance, not your clutter to dispose of whenever you felt like organizing. Dad stood up abruptly, clearly desperate to end the confrontation before it escalated further. I think we all need to take a step back and cool down, he said with the authority he had used when Marcus and I were children fighting over toys. This is supposed to be a celebration, not an argument about storage issues. But his attempt to minimize our conflict as a disagreement about storage issues only demonstrated how completely he had failed to understand what was at stake. This wasn't about organization or space management. It was about Jessica's systematic destruction of everything that connected our family to the woman who had created it, and Dad's willingness to let that destruction continue rather than defend his children's emotional needs. Storage issue, I repeated, feeling years of suppressed anger finally breaking free. She threw away my mother's wedding dress, Dad. She disposed of great-grandmother's christening gown. She scattered Mom's recipe cards in a garbage bag like they were junk. These aren't storage issues. This is deliberate destruction of irreplaceable family treasures. Jessica's composure cracked completely at my direct accusation, revealing the anger she had been concealing behind months of pleasant facade. Those things were taking over our entire house, she snapped. Every closet, every storage area, every spare room was filled with boxes of memories from a life that ended 3 years ago. At what point did the living get to reclaim space from the dead? Her words hung in the air like a physical presence, finally giving voice to the resentment that had been driving her actions all along. Jessica viewed my mother not as a beloved family member whose memory deserved respect, but as a competitor whose continued presence in our lives threatened her own security and happiness. Every photo, every recipe card, every piece of jewelry represented evidence of a love that preceded her relationship with Dad, proof that she was not his first or only choice for a life partner. Dad sank back into his chair, his face reflecting the shock of hearing his new wife describe his deceased first wife as someone whose memory needed to be eliminated rather than honored. For the first time since my mother's death, I saw him clearly recognize the choice he was being forced to make between Jessica's comfort and his children's emotional well-being. Jessica, that's enough, he said quietly, his voice carrying a firmness I hadn't heard him use with her before. Elena wasn't just the dead. She was my wife for 25 years and the mother of my children. Her memory deserves respect in this family, but Jessica was beyond caring about diplomatic language or family harmony. Respect is one thing, David, she said, using his full name in a way that sounded like a warning, but living in a shrine to your previous marriage is something else entirely. I've been patient for 2 years, trying to be understanding about Sarah's need to hoard every scrap of paper with Elena's handwriting on it. but I'm not going to spend the rest of my life competing with a ghost for space in my own home. The admission that she viewed herself as competing with my dead mother for relevance in Dad's life explained everything about her behavior since joining our family. Jessica had never been trying to build relationships with Marcus and me or honor our mother's memory. She had been systematically eliminating any evidence that Elena had ever existed, hoping to create a reality where Dad's life began when he met her. I stood up from the table, recognizing that this conversation had crossed a point of no return. The careful balance of polite coexistence that had characterized our relationship for 2 years was over, replaced by honest acknowledgement of the fundamental incompatibility between Jessica's needs and our family's emotional reality. "I want everything that belonged to my mother," I said, looking directly at Dad rather than Jessica. "Every box, every item, every piece of paper that you haven't already thrown away, and I want it now, before you move and use that as an excuse to dispose of anything else." Dad looked between Jessica and me, clearly torn between competing loyalties but finally forced to choose sides in a conflict he had been avoiding for too long. "Sarah, that seems reasonable," he said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that would define our relationship going forward. "If there are still items in the house that belong to your mother, you should have the opportunity to claim them." Jessica's face flushed with anger at Dad's capitulation to my demands. "Fine," she said, standing abruptly and beginning to clear dishes with unnecessary force, "but I want everything gone by next weekend. I'm not living with boxes of Elena's things for one more day than necessary." The ultimatum was clearly designed to make the process as difficult as possible, forcing me to arrange immediate transportation and storage for whatever remained of my mother's belongings. But I was beyond caring about Jessica's convenience or timeline. After 2 years of watching my family's history disappear one organizing session at a time, I was prepared to rent a truck and remove everything that afternoon if necessary. "I'll be here tomorrow evening after work," I told Dad, ignoring Jessica entirely. "And I'm bringing Marcus home from college to help. We'll take everything at once so you don't have to worry about it anymore." As I gathered my coat and purse to leave, Jessica made one final attempt to position herself as the reasonable party in our conflict. "Sarah, I hope you can understand that this isn't personal," she said with a return to her diplomatic tone. "I've tried to be respectful of your feelings, but sometimes moving forward requires making difficult decisions about the past." I turned to face her fully, no longer interested in maintaining the polite fiction that had governed our interactions for 2 years. "Throwing away my mother's wedding dress was personal, Jessica," I said clearly. "Disposing of family heirlooms that belonged to my children by inheritance was personal. Don't pretend this was about organization or moving forward. This was about erasing every trace of the woman who came before you." Dad walked me to the door in silence, his expression reflecting the complexity of emotions he was struggling to process. On the threshold, he finally spoke the words I had been waiting to hear for 2 years. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I should have protected your mother's things better. I should have protected you and Marcus better." The apology meant everything and nothing, coming too late to save the irreplaceable items that had already been lost, but offering hope that our relationship might survive the damage that had been done. I hugged him tightly, feeling like I was embracing the father I remembered from childhood rather than the man who had allowed Jessica to systematically destroy our family's legacy. Driving home to Boulder, I felt the strange combination of victory and loss that comes with finally standing up to someone who has been taking advantage of your good nature. I had protected what remained of my mother's belongings, and forced Dad to choose between his new wife's preferences and his children's needs. But the cost had been the end of any possibility of peaceful coexistence with Jessica and the recognition that our family would never again include everyone I wanted it to include. That evening, I called Marcus and explained what had happened at brunch, including the ultimatum about removing everything within a week. His response was immediate and fierce. He would drive home from college the next day and help me collect everything that remained. For the first time since our mother's death, we were united in a common cause that felt worthy of the promises we had made to her. The next 24 hours would reveal exactly what Jessica had chosen to preserve and what she had already destroyed,
setting the stage for a confrontation that would change our family dynamics forever. Marcus arrived at my apartment Tuesday evening with a borrowed pickup truck and an expression of grim determination I hadn't seen since our mother's funeral. He had driven straight from college after his last class, bringing along his roommate Jake to help with the heavy lifting. The three of us spent the evening planning our strategy for efficiently removing everything from Dad and Jessica's townhouse, while minimizing the potential for additional confrontation. "I still can't believe she threw away the christening gown," Marcus said for the third time as we loaded boxes and packing materials into the truck. "That thing was over 100 years old. You can't just replace something like that." Jake, who had met our mother several times during high school, listened quietly as we explained the significance of the items Jessica had discarded. "Your mom always seemed like such a thoughtful person," he said finally. "She made those amazing brownies every time I came over. This Jessica woman sounds like the complete opposite." We arrived at the townhouse Wednesday evening just as Dad was getting home from work. He looked exhausted and older than I remembered, the stress of recent family tensions clearly taking a toll on his appearance and energy. Jessica's car wasn't in the driveway, which felt like a small mercy given the confrontational atmosphere that had characterized our last interaction. "Thank you for bringing help," Dad said to Marcus, embracing him with obvious relief. "I've been dreading this conversation with Jessica about what's actually left. She's been unusually quiet since Sunday, which usually means she's planning something." He led us down to the basement, where I was shocked to discover far more boxes than Jessica had led me to believe existed. An entire corner of the storage area was filled with containers I had never seen before, stacked haphazardly as if they had been moved recently from somewhere else in the house. The casual mention of a few boxes had been a deliberate misrepresentation of what remained. "Dad, where did all of this come from?" I asked, immediately suspicious of the timing and presentation. He looked uncomfortable, running his hand through his hair in a gesture I recognized from childhood moments when he had to confess something difficult. "Jessica moved everything down here over the past few weeks," he admitted. "She said she wanted to consolidate all the family items in one place to make it easier for you to go through them. But as we began opening boxes, it became clear that Jessica's consolidation had been far more extensive than Dad realized. Mixed in with my mother's legitimate belongings were items I knew had been displayed throughout their house until recently, family photos that had been removed from frames, decorative objects that had belonged to my mother, even some of Dad's own mementos from his marriage that Jessica had apparently decided needed to be eliminated. She's been systematically removing every trace of Mom from the entire house," Marcus observed, holding up a framed photo of our parents' wedding that had been sitting on Dad's nightstand for as long as I could remember. "This isn't organizing, Dad. This is erasure." Dad's face reflected genuine shock as he recognized items he hadn't realized were missing from their daily environment. Jessica's campaign had been so gradual and subtle that he hadn't noticed the accumulation of small removals that collectively eliminated my mother's presence from their home entirely. The most shocking discovery came in a box that had been carefully packed and sealed, unlike the others that showed signs of hasty organization. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was my mother's jewelry collection, not just the pieces I had retrieved from the jewelry box, but significant items I had been told were missing or damaged beyond repair. "Jessica said these were lost," I said, holding up my mother's pearl necklace, the one Dad had given her for their 10th anniversary. "She told me some of the jewelry had fallen out during packing and couldn't be found." Dad's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching anger as he realized the extent of Jessica's deception. "These were in our bedroom dresser," he said quietly. "She told me you had already taken all of your mother's jewelry. I never thought to check." We worked in increasingly uncomfortable silence as each box revealed new evidence of Jessica's deliberate concealment and misrepresentation. Items she claimed had been water damaged were in perfect condition. Books she said were falling apart were merely well-loved but completely readable. Family photos she insisted were duplicates of ones I already had were unique images I had never seen before. It was Marcus who found the item that changed everything. In a box tucked behind the others as if hidden rather than simply stored, was my mother's laptop computer, the same laptop where she had recorded video messages for future birthdays and milestones, the device that contained her final words to us for occasions she knew she wouldn't be present to celebrate. "Sarah, look at this," Marcus said, his voice tight with emotion, as he lifted the familiar silver computer from its protective wrapping. "She saved it. Mom's laptop is here." My hands trembled as I took the device from him, remembering the hours my mother had spent in her final months creating digital legacies for her children. She had been so methodical about recording messages for our future weddings, graduations, and other significant life events, knowing that her voice would be the closest thing to her presence we could have during those moments. "I thought this was lost in the move," Dad said, staring at the laptop with an expression of wonder and regret. "Jessica said the movers couldn't find it, that it must have been misplaced during the packing process." But the careful way the laptop had been wrapped and hidden suggested something far more deliberate than a moving accident. Jessica had known exactly where it was and had chosen to conceal its existence, rather than allow us access to our mother's final message. The realization that she had been actively hiding our inheritance, rather than simply disposing of it, revealed a level of calculated cruelty I hadn't imagined her capable of. "We need to see what's on here," I said, though part of me feared what we might discover about how much Jessica knew about the laptop's contents. Dad led us upstairs to the kitchen table, where I carefully opened the laptop and pressed the power button. To my amazement, it started immediately, the battery still holding enough charge to boot up after all this time. The desktop background was a photo of our family from Marcus's high school graduation, all four of us, smiling together in what had been our last complete family portrait. The video files were organized in folders labeled with our names and future occasions: Sarah's wedding, Marcus's graduation, 30th birthdays, first grandchild, and several others. Each folder contained multiple videos recorded on different days, capturing our mother's thoughts and wishes for events she wouldn't live to see. With shaking hands, I clicked on a folder labeled General Messages, and selected a video file dated just 2 weeks before her death. My mother's face appeared on the screen, thin and pale from her illness, but radiating the warmth and love that had defined her throughout our childhood.
"Hello, my darlings," her recorded voice said, as clear and present as if she were sitting beside us. "If you're watching this, it means I'm no longer with you, and you've found these messages I've been creating. I hope they bring you comfort rather than sadness, because they were made with so much love and hope for your futures." Marcus wiped his eyes with the back of his hand while Dad sat in stunned silence, clearly overwhelmed by hearing his wife's voice after 3 years. But my mother continued speaking, and her next words felt like they had been specifically intended for this moment. "I need you to know that the things I'm leaving behind aren't just objects, they're connections to our family's story and to the love that created you both. Recipe cards, photographs, jewelry, letters. These physical reminders carry emotional DNA that connects you to generations of women who loved their families fiercely.